Hello there, and welcome to the story of one of the most fascinating figures in history, Genghis Khan. His name is often associated with conquest, power, and unimaginable ambition, but behind the legends lies a story of perseverance, vision, and transformation. Today, we'll journey through the life of a man who changed the world forever through both his triumphs and his trials. Settle in as we explore the extraordinary life of Genghis Khan and uncover the moments that shaped not only his empire, but the future of entire civilizations. Part 1. The Birth of a Legend. Temujin's early years 116–21177. In the year 1162, deep in the rugged steppe of what is now Mongolia, a child was born into the Borjigin clan. He was named Temujin, a name said to honor a Tatar chieftain, whom his father had recently defeated. Few could have imagined that this boy, born into a world of tribal warfare, betrayal, and shifting alliances, would one day become Genghis Khan, the most fearsome and influential conqueror the world had ever known. Temujin's early life was defined by hardship. His father, Yasuge, was a tribal chief and a respected warrior. But the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century was a place where allegiances changed with the wind. Power was fragile, and survival often meant betrayal. When Temujin was just 9 years old, Yasuge was poisoned by the Tatars, longtime enemies of the Mongols. His family, now leaderless, was abandoned by their tribe, left to fend for themselves in the harsh, unforgiving wilderness. This abandonment shaped Temujin's worldview. As a child, he scavenged for food, learned to hunt with a bow, and endured the brutal cold of the steppe. But it was not just survival skills that he acquired. He learned the value of loyalty, the sting of betrayal, and the necessity of strength. One infamous episode from his youth reveals the kind of leader he was destined to become. After a dispute over food and leadership, Temujin killed his half-brother Bek. It was a grim act, but one that underscored a relentless determination to assert dominance and protect his family's cohesion. During these formative years, Temujin began forming alliances, the most critical of which was with a young warrior named Jamuka. They swore an oath of blood brotherhood, or Anda, which was sacred among the Mongols. This alliance would play a pivotal role in Temujin's rise and later. In one of his greatest betrayals, at the age of 16, Temujin married Bert, a woman from the Konkret tribe. This union was not just a personal milestone, it was a strategic alliance that bolstered his fledgling power. Soon after their marriage, Bert was kidnapped by a rival tribe, the Temujin's daring raid to rescue her with the help of his allies, including his blood brother Jamuko, was an early testament to his ability to inspire loyalty and act decisively. By his late teens, Temujin was already a seasoned leader, molded by adversity, driven by vengeance, and guided by an unshakable belief in his destiny. He had not yet been declared Khan, nor had he begun his conquests, but the seeds of greatness were firmly planted. What set him apart even then was not just his survival, but his vision. He dreamed of a unified Mongol nation, a people long divided by tribal feuds and personal vendettas. His ambition was radical, and soon the steppe would tremble beneath his banner. To understand Genghis Khan's rise, one must first understand the world he emerged from, a land where kinship dictated loyalty, where betrayal was commonplace, and where strength, both physical and mental, was the only true currency. It was in this crucible of constant conflict that Temujin was forged, and from the flames of hardship, a legend began to take shape. This was just the beginning. Part 2. Rise through the clans. Asserting authority 1177-1189. By 1177, Temujin had emerged from the harshest crucible imaginable, exiled, betrayed, and stripped of the security once guaranteed by his father's rank. His childhood had been one long struggle for survival, not just against the elements, but against hunger, isolation, and betrayal. Yet by the time he was in his mid-teens, he had carved out a place for himself in the tumultuous political landscape of the Mongol steppe. What began as a battle for his family's survival was now becoming a quest for unification, an unprecedented ambition in a world defined by fragmentation. At this stage, Temujin was still a minor warlord. He commanded no massive army, no grand alliances, just a loyal, tightly knit circle of warriors and family. But within this band, seeds of revolution had taken root. He began challenging not just other tribal leaders, but the very structure of Mongol society. Among the Mongol and steppe peoples, power traditionally belonged to the aristocracy, those who could claim noble lineage and inherited rights. Temujin, although from a respected line, had been cut off from this system. Rather than attempt to re-enter it, he sought to overturn it. He began elevating men not by bloodline, but by ability. His trusted allies like Jelm, who once saved Temujin's life by sucking infected blood from a wound, and Bawoku, who stood by him from youth, were not nobles. They were chosen for their loyalty, skill, and courage. This meritocratic approach shook the established norms, creating deep animosity among the noble families. But it also won him something far more valuable: undying loyalty from the lower classes and dispossessed warriors, who saw in Temujin a path to power they'd never been offered before. During these years, Temujin worked tirelessly to expand his influence. He forged strategic alliances with neighboring clans and tribes, often marrying off his daughters or sisters to bind key families to his cause. He offered protection, security, and access to plunder for those who joined him and harsh retribution for those who betrayed him. His network of allies grew cautiously but steadily, weaving a web of political connections that reached far beyond the handful of warriors he had started with. But his ambitions would soon meet resistance from a familiar face: Jarmuka, his one-time blood brother and childhood companion. The bond of Anda was sacred among the Mongols, akin to spiritual kinship. But as Temujin grew in power and deviated from the established aristocratic order, Jarmuka emerged as his ideological and military rival. Where Temujin envisioned a unified Mongol nation led by merit, Jarmuka championed the old order of society ruled by hereditary nobles and guarded traditions. Their rivalry came to a head in 1187. Both men were declared Khants by their respective factions. The steppe was split not just between two leaders, but between two worldviews. Temujin's forces represented innovation, reform, and inclusivity. Jarmuka's camp symbolized the entrenched nobility and its resistance to change. The ensuing conflict, though not yet decisive, marked the beginning of a civil war that would engulf the Mongol steppe. Before that war would erupt fully, however, Temujin focused on solidifying internal cohesion. He implemented an early form of what would later become the Yasahis Code of Law, while the Yasa would be more fully realized in the years to come. Even in this early period, Temujin's sense of order was evident. He insisted on discipline among his warriors, punished theft and disobedience harshly, and mandated the sharing of plunder according to merit and contribution, not rank. He also invested in establishing a loyal intelligence network. Scouts and spies were placed among neighboring tribes and enemies. He sought information as keenly as he sought territory, understanding that knowledge of terrain, of troop movement, of loyalty was often the difference between victory and defeat. This emphasis on information gathering and preemptive strategy would come to define his military campaigns in the future. Temujin's leadership was also spiritual. While he would never establish a state religion, and would later welcome all faiths within his empire, he claimed divine favor through the Tengrith, eternal blue sky worshipped by Mongol tribes. He began to speak of his destiny as divinely sanctioned, a belief that helped inspire his followers and legitimize his rise. His wife, Bert, too, played a crucial role during this period. Though often absent from the battlefield, she managed domestic and political affairs with astute judgment. Her captivity and recovery had forged a special bond between them. She acted as an advisor and intermediary, especially in dealings with powerful women of allied tribes. In the power dynamics of the steppe, where women could hold considerable influence within clan politics, Bert's role was indispensable. In 1189, with his reputation growing and his following expanding, Temujin was officially declared Khan of the Mongols by a council of tribal leaders. This was not yet the title of Genghis Khan, nor was it universal recognition, but it was a monumental step. It meant he was no longer a rogue warlord, but a legitimate contender for supremacy over the steppe. The declaration was made at a traditional Kurultia council meeting of tribal chieftains. There, amid the windswept plains, the young leader who had once scavenged for food with his starving family accepted the weight of command. His army was still relatively small by modern standards, perhaps a few thousand strong, but it was organized, loyal, and battle-hardened. His vision was clear, and the strategy to achieve it was forming. He would continue to expand his alliances, defeat his rivals, and impose order on the chaos of the steppe. He was no longer content to simply survive. He was ready to conquer. In the background, the old nobility seethed. Jamuka was not done, and their confrontation would soon escalate into one of the bloodiest battles the steppe had seen. But Temujin was no longer a struggling orphan. He was a Khanov, a people, of an idea, of a future not yet written but already roaring across the plains like a storm. The rise of Genghis Khan had begun in earnest. Part 3. The Battle for Supremacy, Civil War and the Road to Unity, 1189-1206. The declaration of Temujin as Khan in 1189 was not a conclusion, it was the beginning of a relentless campaign that would transform a scattered people into a singular nation. For all the prestige and hope of that Kurultai, the reality was that Temujin's control remained tenuous. Many Mongol tribes remained aligned with rival leaders or were committed to the old aristocratic order. Chief among Temujin's opponents was Jamuka, his once beloved Anda, who had been raised in the traditional aristocracy and now stood as the symbolic and literal obstacle to Temujin's vision. The next decade would become a crucible of war, diplomacy, reform, and survival. It was during these years between 1189 and 1206 that Temujin's leadership would be tested beyond all measure. Through bitter defeats, unlikely victories, and the constant threat of betrayal, he honed the qualities that would make him Genghis Khan in 1190. Shortly after being proclaimed Khan, Temujin sought to consolidate his influence by launching a series of military campaigns. These operations weren't only about conquests. They were about demonstrating authority and establishing a new order. He moved against tribal rivals who refused allegiance and positioned himself as a protector of the weak, redistributing resources and punishing exploitative chieftains. His army, though modest in size, operated with a unity and discipline unusual for steppe warriors. The loyalty he inspired allowed him to impose a rigid structure. Every soldier knew their role. Every commander was chosen for talent rather than birth, and communication on the battlefield became an art form in his hands. But Temujin's rise provoked a reaction. Jarmuka, alarmed by the sweeping changes and the growing support Temujin garnered from both commoners and lower-ranked nobility, moved to challenge his authority directly. In 1189, Jarmuka was declared Gua Khan, the universal ruler, by a coalition of tribal aristocrats. This was a direct counter to Temujin's khanship and a declaration of civil war. In 1190, the first significant confrontation occurred. The two forces clashed near the Anan River. Temujin's smaller but better disciplined army was unable to withstand the sheer numerical superiority of Jarmuka's traditionalist coalition. The battle ended in defeat for Temujin, forcing a temporary retreat, but the consequences were far more brutal than a simple loss of territory. Jarmuka, in a show of vengeance and power, captured and executed 70 of Temujin's commanders by boiling them alive. This act of cruelty would be remembered and recounted for years, fueling hatred and steeling the resolve of Temujin's followers. Yet Temujin did not falter. He regrouped. His army dispersed but did not disintegrate. Over the next several years, he focused not only on rebuilding his strength but on refining his political and military systems. He made overtures to smaller, unaffiliated tribes, promising safety, fairness, and a share in the spoils of conquest. He married his daughters and sisters into powerful lineages, strengthening his network. He introduced formal ranks and units within his army, the Arbon groups of 10, Zuin 100, Mingan 1000, and Tumen 10,000, creating a flexible and scalable command structure that could operate independently or collectively, depending on the demands of battle. Temujin also began the early codification of laws that would later become the Yasa. These laws, though unwritten in this period, were passed down orally and covered everything from military discipline to property rights, civil conduct, and family relations. They emphasized loyalty, obedience, unity, and harsh penalties for insubordination. This legal foundation helped transform his ragtag collection of followers into a proto-state one, where justice flowed from the Khan, not from ancient traditions or tribal customs. In the early 1200s, Temujin began to take the offensive again. One by one, he defeated the smaller tribes that supported Jarmuka or remained neutral. He used a combination of psychological warfare, diplomacy, and battlefield prowess. In many cases, he offered terms before engaging in battle. Those who submitted were spared, often welcomed into his ranks. Those who resisted were met with swift and often total destruction. By 1201, Temujin had gained enough traction to challenge Jarmuka directly once more. In that year, a new Kurultai among the eastern Mongol tribes declared Jarmuka Gua Khan once again, but this time Temujin was prepared. His forces were now larger, more professional, and guided by superior intelligence. In a decisive confrontation, Temujin crushed Jarmuka's coalition. Jarmuka fled, but his support base had been gutted. It took several more years of maneuvering before Temujin would capture his old rival. When he finally did, in 1206, he offered Jamuka a chance to join him. Jamuka, perhaps out of pride, perhaps recognizing the ideological chasm that separated them, declined. He asked for a noble death, and Temujin granted it. Jamuka was executed without torturer, stark contrast to the atrocities committed earlier in their conflict. The steppe was finally unified under one banner. At a great Kurultai held by the Anan River that same year, Temujin was formally proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. This title was not merely symbolic. For the first time in recorded history, the disparate Mongol and Turkic tribes were united under a single leader, governed by a common set of laws and organized into a formidable military machine. The ceremony of his coronation was steeped in tradition but marked by innovation. Shamans declared that Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had bestowed divine mandate upon Genghis Khan. Tribal leaders swore oaths of loyalty, not just to him, but to the idea of a greater Mongol nation. This was no longer a loose federation of clans. It was the genesis of an empire. With the internal strife behind him, Genghis Khan now turned his gaze outward. His ambition, forged in suffering and sharpened by warfare, would soon stretch beyond the Mongolian steppe. The next chapter would take him into foreign empire Khwarizm, Jin, China, the Islamic caliphates where he would not just challenge the might of ancient civilizations, but forever change the trajectory of world history. But at the dawn of his empire, one thing was already certain. Genghis Khan had risen not through luck or birthright, but through a relentless, ruthless commitment to unity, law, and discipline. The man who once begged for scraps was now the undisputed master of the steppes. Part 4. Foundations of Empire, Reform, Loyalty, and Expansion 120-61211. With the crowning of Genghis Khan in 1206, the Mongol people stood at the precipice of a new era. The unification of the tribes under a single banner marked not only a political victory, but also a cultural and ideological revolution. The Mongol steppe had never known such cohesion, and the new Khan was determined to ensure that this unity endured far beyond his lifetime. What followed was a flurry of institutional, legal, and administrative innovations that would transform a nomadic coalition into an empire of astonishing longevity and scope. Genghis Khan's first order of business after his coronation was to solidify his control over the newly formed Mongol nation. Despite the widespread acclaim and ritual affirmations of loyalty, the threat of tribal fragmentation still loomed. To counter this, he pursued a deliberate campaign of social restructuring. The centuries-old aristocratic clan system, which had long dictated the Mongol social order, was dismantled. In its place, Genghis instituted a system of meritocracy and unorthodox decision for a society that had been steeped in tradition. The army was central to this vision. Genghis Khan understood that the military was both the sword and the glue of his empire. He formalized the decimal system of organization he had developed during his years of civil war. The army was divided into units of 10 arbon, 100 zuin, 1,000 mingan, and 10,000 tumon. These units were intentionally designed to mix members of different tribes. Loyalty to one's immediate unit and commander now superseded loyalty to tribal kin. In doing so, Genghis erased the lingering divisions of blood and replaced them with bonds forged through shared duty and survival. The concept of promotion based on merit rather than lineage permeated all ranks of governance. Commanders were chosen for their bravery, tactical acumen, and loyalty. Even former enemies, if they demonstrated valor or strategic insight, could rise within the new order. Genghis Khan himself led by example. He rewarded initiative, punished betrayal swiftly, and maintained an egalitarian simplicity in his own habits. He wore the same rough wool as his soldiers and shared in their rations. His personal charisma, combined with the new legalistic framework, created a political culture that bound people together more tightly than lineage ever had. The legal code, though not written down in his lifetime, came to be known as the Yasa. More than a set of laws, the Yasa represented a philosophical foundation for the empire. It addressed issues as varied as theft, adultery, military conduct, inheritance, and religion. Punishments were often severed for betrayal, disobedience, or theft, but these laws were applied universally. Even family members of the Khan were not exempt. This impartiality bred respect and fear in equal measure. Religious tolerance became another hallmark of Genghis Khan's rule. Though he remained a shamanist, he welcomed people of all faiths into his court. Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and Confucians alike. He believed that spiritual belief was a private matter and that the gods of each people should be honored in their own way. This approach was not born of abstract liberalism, but of pragmatism. By allowing diverse religions to flourish, Genghis prevented internal unrest and garnered support from conquered peoples. Religious figures were often exempt from taxes and military service, further cementing their loyalty. Between 1206 and 1211, Genghis Khan set out to extend his control beyond the Mongolian heartland. His first significant campaign as the ruler of a unified Mongolia was against the Western Shire dynasty, also known as the Tranquil. The Tanguts controlled a prosperous kingdom to the south and west of the Gobi Desert, one that straddled the Silk Road and offered rich plunder and valuable trade routes. It was both a strategic and economic prize. Genghis launched his campaign. In 1207, with a relatively modest force, he began by subjugating the various forest peoples of Siberia, who lived north of the Tangut domain. These tribes, once assimilated, added manpower and regional knowledge to his forces. He then crossed into Tangut territory in 1209. The campaign demonstrated the full maturation of Mongol military doctrine. Speed, mobility, psychological warfare, and strict discipline defined every movement. The Mongol cavalry, riding for days without rest, appeared where least expected. Cities fell not just through siege, but from fear and surrender. The Mongols used captured engineers from earlier conquests to help build siege machines and exploit weaknesses in fortified cities. Genghis's ability to learn and adapt from each campaign made every subsequent battle more efficient than the last dot. In 1210, the Tanguts sued for peace. They acknowledged Genghis Khan as their overlord and offered tribute. Though he accepted their submission, Genghis made note of their hesitancy and arrogance. It would not be the last time he would deal with the Tanju test. Flush with victory. Genghis returned to Mongolia with more than just treasure. He had proved to the Mongol people that their empire could project power beyond their steppe and succeed. This was not merely conquest for conquest's sake. It was a demonstration of destiny. Tengri, the eternal blue sky, had chosen Genghis Khan as its agent of order at home. Genghis continued to build his state. He established a network of spies and messengers. The Yam system, an early form of a postal relay network, began to take shape. Riders stationed at intervals across the empire could relay messages with astonishing speed. This infrastructure allowed the Khan to maintain control over a vast territory and receive timely reports on revolts, opportunities, and threats. During this period, too, Genghis developed a fascination with knowledge. He surrounded himself with scholars, linguists, and foreign emissaries. Captured scribes and scientists were rarely executed instead. They were often relocated to Karakoram, or wherever Genghis was campaigning. He sought to learn about the customs and governance of every people he encountered. The knowledge would be weaponized later, not through destruction, but through administration and assimilation. By 1211, the Mongol Empire was no longer a regional power. It was an ascending force with eyes on the vast riches of China. The Jin dynasty, bloated with wealth and corruption, stood to the south. Genghis Khan, ever ambitious, viewed it not just as a target but as a stepping stone. Yet before the clash with the Jin would begin in earnest, Genghis Khan had already accomplished what no other steppe warlord had achieved. He had forged unity from chaos. He had turned a collection of scattered, warring tribes into a disciplined nation-state. He had elevated merit above blood and law above whim. And he had done it all while remaining, in spirit, a nomad. The world beyond the steppe had begun to stir. The merchants of the Silk Road, the monks of Tibet, the nobles of Persia, they would soon feel the tremors of a power rising in the east. The thunder of hooves that echoed across the plains in 1206 was now a chorus that would shake the foundations of civilizations. The age of the Mongols had truly begun. Part 5. The Mongol Storm Breaks. The War Against the Jin Dynasty 121–11215. The war with the Jin dynasty marked Genghis Khan's first major confrontation with a sophisticated, sedentary civilization. The Jin, who ruled over northern China, had grown wealthy and complacent over decades of dominance. Their vast cities, high walls, and immense population presented challenges unlike any the Mongols had faced before. But for Genghis Khan, these were opportunities cloaked as obstacles. The campaign began in 1211. At its core, the invasion was not merely about land or tribute, it was an ideological clash between nomadic discipline and urban opulence. Genghis had no illusions about the magnitude of what he was undertaking. The Jin dynasty's military strength was formidable, its cities heavily fortified, and its leadership entrenched in bureaucratic traditions. But he also recognized their vulnerabilities: internal corruption, over-reliance on static defenses, and a restive peasantry burdened by taxes. In preparation for this campaign, Genghis Khan gathered an army that some estimates place at 100,000 to 150,000 warriors. He convened a Kurultai, a council of chiefs, to solidify plans and unify his generals. Under a common vision, among his key commanders were his trusted sons, Joki, Chagatai, and Ogedei, as well as the brilliant Sabatai and Jeeb, two men whose names would become synonymous with Mongol conquest. The invasion route was carefully calculated. The Mongols bypassed heavily fortified positions to strike deeper into Jin territory, disrupting supply lines and sapping morale. Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple wings to strike simultaneously at various strategic points. He was a master of feigned retreats and diversionary attacks, tactics that confused even the most seasoned Jin generals. One of the earliest major victories was at the pass of Yehuling, a narrow mountain corridor defended by the Jin. Genghis Khan sent a decoy force to draw the defenders out, while his main army flanked them through a hidden path revealed by local scouts. The Jin forces were caught in a pincer movement and annihilated. This victory opened the northern plains of China, too. the Mongol horde and shattered the illusion of Jin invulnerability. Following Yehuling, city after city fell under Mongol pressure. The Mongols didn't merely rely on brute strength. They co-opted Chinese engineers and defectors to build siege equipment. Battering rams, catapults, and siege towers, previously foreign to Mongol warfare, became staples of their arsenals. Genghis Khan adapted and absorbed every lesson from the enemy, turning their advantages into tools for his own success. Perhaps the most significant psychological blow came with the siege of Zhongdu, the Jin capital modern-day Beijing. The city was vast and heavily fortified, with a population that dwarfed any Mongol encampment. But Genghis understood the psychology of siege. He surrounded the city, cut off supply routes, and launched a series of probing attacks to wear down defenders. For months, Zhongdu held out, bolstered by promises of reinforcements that never arrived. Inside the walls, famine set in. Reports from the time speak of desperate citizens turning to cannibalism, while the ruling elite squabbled over how to negotiate peace. Outside, the Mongols remained patient, rotating troops and keeping morale high. Eventually, in 1215, after a prolonged siege, Zhongdu fell. The Mongols sacked the city, but not indiscriminately. Key artisans, scribes, and officials were spared and absorbed into the Mongol system. The fall of Zhongdu sent shockwaves throughout the Jin realm. It symbolized not just the loss of a city, but of legitimacy. Genghis Khan did not occupy the city permanently. Instead, he withdrew northward, his point proven. He had exposed the Jin's vulnerability and demonstrated Mongol supremacy. More than a conqueror, Genghis was now a living legend, a figure whose name inspired awe and dread across Asia. After the campaign, Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia, not to rest but to consolidate his growing empire. He held another Kurultai, where he redistributed lands, discussed further campaigns, and reaffirmed his commitment to law and unity. Veterans of the Jin campaign were rewarded with new herds and titles. Chinese administrators, now under Mongol service, began helping develop more advanced tax systems and record-keeping practices. This integration of Chinese knowledge was pivotal. The Mongols were still nomads at heart, but they were becoming empire builders. Genghis Khan was already looking westward, toward the mysterious lands beyond the mountains. Traders brought stories of rich cities in Central Asia, defiant Khwarezmian Shahs, and strange new technologies. The Silk Road, now under Mongol protection, became a river of information as much as commerce. But before turning to new horizons, Genghis ensured that the lessons of the Jin campaign were embedded into his military doctrine. He emphasized the value of discipline, psychological warfare, and cross-cultural intelligence gathering. Every victory was studied, every defeat dissected. His sons were trained not just as warriors, but as rulers. Each one was given governance responsibilities to prepare for the day when the empire would span from ocean to ocean. By 1215, Genghis Khan had achieved the unthinkable, the destruction of a centuries-old dynasty, the transformation of a tribal society into a transcontinental force, and the forging of a legacy that would echo across the ages. The world had not yet grasped the full extent of his ambition, but it was beginning to understand his power, and Genghis was just getting started. Part 6. The Khwarezmian Campaign. Fury unleashed across Central Asia, 121-812-21. By 1218, Genghis Khan stood at a precipice. His conquest of the Jin dynasty had secured his eastern flank and demonstrated the might of the Mongol war machine. but his eyes were fixed westward toward the flourishing Islamic world. Specifically, the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful realm that stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. Rich in trade and culture, this empire would soon become the target of one of the most ruthless and consequential campaigns in Mongol history. The catalyst for this campaign wasn't a land dispute or an imperial ambition, but a trade caravan. Genghis Khan, ever the pragmatist, had initially approached the Khwarezmian Shah, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, with a gesture of peace and commerce. He dispatched a caravan of 500 merchants, accompanied by Mongol diplomats, to open trade relations. But the Shah, suspicious of Mongol intentions, or perhaps acting on local governor advice, ordered the caravan seized. Accusations of espionage led to the merchants being imprisoned, tortured, and eventually executed. In response, Genghis Khan sent a delegation of 3 envoys to demand justice. What happened next sealed the Shah's fate. The Shah had one of the Mongol envoys executed and the others humiliated. This was more than an insult, it was a breach of sacred diplomatic custom. For Genghis Khan, who valued honor and trust as key pillars of diplomacy, it was unforgivable. His reaction was swift and absolute. War was declared. Genghis Khan gathered an army estimated at over 200,000 men, one of the largest mobilizations of his reign. This was not simply a punitive expedition, it was total war. The Mongol war machine, now sharpened by years of conquest and innovation, was unleashed upon the Khwarezmian Empire with terrifying precision. The campaign began in 1219. Mongol forces moved swiftly across the Siadarya River and into Transoxiana, the eastern provinces of the Khwarezmian realm. The first major target was the city of Otra, whose governor had played a key role in the caravan massacre. Genghis laid siege to the city with relentless force. After months of resistance, Otra fell. The governor was captured, and legend holds that molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears, a brutal symbol of retribution. From there, the Mongols split into multiple columns, a tactic they had mastered. Coordinated assaults launched from different directions to overwhelm the enemy. Cities such as Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur fell one by one. In Bukhara, Genghis Khan reportedly addressed the population from the steps of a mosque, declaring, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." His psychological warfare was as potent as his military strategy. In Samarkand, a city with formidable defenses and a large garrison, Genghis deployed feigned retreats to lure defenders out of the city walls, only to ambush them in the open. The city surrendered after intense fighting, and the Mongols took thousands of artisans, engineers, and scholars captive to be resettled within the empire. The rest were often slaughtered. The Shah, realizing the scale of the Mongol threat, attempted to regroup, but he was outmaneuvered at every turn. He fled westward, abandoning city after city, hoping to find refuge in his western provinces. Genghis Khan dispatched his top generals, Subutai and Jebe, to hunt him down. This pursuit would take them across Persia and even into the Caucasus, a journey of thousands of miles that would test the endurance and reach of the Mongol cavalry. Meanwhile, other Mongol contingents razed the cities of Merv and Herat, where death tolls were staggering hundreds of thousands by some accounts. The Mongols, though often portrayed as indiscriminately brutal, did not engage in wanton destruction. For no reason. They used calculated terror to suppress resistance. Cities that surrendered were often spared. Those that resisted faced annihilation by 1221. the Khwarezmian Empire had effectively ceased to exist. The Shah, broken and fugitive, died on an island in the Caspian Sea. His son, Jalal ad-Din, attempted to rally what remained of their forces, and he would prove to be a tenacious opponent, even defeating a Mongol detachment at the Battle of Parwan. But his victories were short-lived. Genghis personally led an army to confront him, driving him across the Indus River. Jalal ad-Din escaped to India, but the Khwarezmian legacy was in ruins. The conquest of Khwarezm was not just a military victory, it was a geopolitical earthquake. It shattered one of the Islamic world's great powers, opened vast swaths of Central Asia to Mongol influence, and cemented Genghis Khan's reputation as a force of nature. His empire now stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Persian Gulf. Trade routes like the Silk Road came under Mongol protection, and cultural exchanges between East and West flourished under this newfound stability, albeit enforced by fear. Yet, the campaign also marked a shift in Mongol policy. Genghis began to understand the fragility of empires and the importance of administering them. Cities that once defied him were now governed by Mongol officials or local rulers under Mongol supervision. Bureaucratic systems were imported, taxation systems refined, and a rudimentary postal system, the Yam, began to connect the empire's vast expanse. In the aftermath, Genghis Khan returned to Mongolia, but he did not rest. Reports of resistance in the West, political squabbles among his sons, and distant rumors of powerful kingdoms in Europe began to stir his curiosity. The empire had grown faster than any in history, but its survival would depend on how it was managed still. The Khwarezmian campaign stood as the high water mark of Genghis Khan's military genius. He had taken a perceived insult and forged it into a campaign that reshaped the map of the known world. His enemies underestimated him, his own people revered him, and across the ruins of a fallen empire, one truth rang clear. Genghis Khan had become not just a conqueror, but a legend. Part 7. The Hunt for Jalal ad-Din and the March to the West 12 to 112-3. As the dust settled over the ruins of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1221, Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the final remnants of resistance. The fugitive prince, Jalal ad-Din, son of Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad, had evaded capture and taken refuge in the eastern edges of Persia. He was young, driven, and determined to avenge his father's downfall. For Genghis Khan, allowing a spark of rebellion to survive was unthinkable. Determined to stamp out any trace of resistance, Genghis launched an expedition to pursue Jalal ad-Din. The terrain was unforgiving. Rugged mountains, scorching deserts, and swollen rivers lay ahead, but the Mongol army was undeterred. In a remarkable show of endurance, Genghis himself led the pursuit, crossing the Hindu Kush, a feat that stunned contemporaries and modern historians alike. Jalal ad-Din, aware that the Mongols were close on his heels, rallied a force and turned to make a stand near the Indus River. The Battle of the Indus in 1221 was a final act of defiance. Though outnumbered and facing veterans of countless campaigns, Jalal ad-Din fought with desperation. His troops, comprised of Khwarezmian remnants and local allies, clashed with the Mongol vanguard in a brutal engagement. The battle ended in disaster for Jalal ad-Din. His army was routed, and the Mongols pressed him hard to the riverbank. In a scene immortalized by chroniclers, Jalal ad-Din, rather than surrender, spurred his horse and leaped into the roaring river. Miraculously, he survived the crossing and escaped into the Punjab, eventually seeking asylum in India. Genghis Khan, watching from the cliffs above, purportedly admired the prince's courage, though he would never cease to see him as a threat. With Jalal ad-Din gone, Genghis had effectively erased the Khwarezmian line. But the campaign did not end. In what would become one of the most audacious operations in medieval military history, Genghis ordered two of his most trusted generals Subutai and Gib to continue west. Their mission was not simply punitive, was reconnaissance by force. They were to probe the strength of the Western world and bring back intelligence. The journey of Subutai and Gib took them through the Caucasus Mountains and into unfamiliar territories. Along the way, they encountered the Kingdom of Georgia, a Christian realm then experiencing a golden age. In 1221 to 1222, Mongol forces clashed with Georgian armies in a series of skirmishes and battles. Despite fierce resistance, the Mongols used their signature tactics: feigned retreats, ambushes, and sudden flanking maneuvers to devastate Georgian forces. They sacked Tbilisi, the capital, before turning northward. What followed was even more remarkable. The Mongol detachment entered the steppe lands north of the Black Sea, where they encountered various Turkic and Kipchak tribes, some of whom had ties to the defeated Khwarezmians. The Mongols subdued or recruited many of these nomads as they advanced. In 1223, they confronted a coalition of Russian principalities and the Cumans on the banks of the Kalka River. This battle, now largely forgotten by the Western world, was pivotal. The Mongols faced a coalition of Slavic and Turkic forces, poorly coordinated and divided by rivalries. Subutai and Gib used their standard playbook. They feigned retreat, drawing the coalition into a long pursuit, then turned and annihilated them in a devastating counterattack. The aftermath of the Battle of the Kalka River was gruesome. Thousands of Rus soldiers were slaughtered. Mongols executed leaders of the Russian coalition by placing wooden planks on top of them and holding a victory feast, slowly crushing the nobles beneath the weight. The Mongol message to the wider world was clear. Defiance would be met with utter annihilation. After their astonishing journey, Subutai and Gib's forces did not press further west into Europe. Their mission had been completed. They had scouted the political landscape, tested enemy strength, and planted seeds of fear. They turned east and rejoined Genghis Khan. Meanwhile, Genghis returned to Mongolia in 1223. He had been away from the heartland of his empire for nearly a decade. What he found upon his return was a changed world. His once nomadic people were now rulers of vast cities, governors of multicultural territories, and participants in a global economy. The Mongol administrative system, still crude by later standards, had evolved dramatically. Genghis began codifying laws, his famous Yasa setting down rules on loyalty, justice, military conduct, and civil behavior. The Great Khan was no longer simply a warlord. He was an emperor, ruling a dominion larger than any ever seen. He convened a Kurultai, a council of Mongol nobles, and began discussions on succession, the division of newly conquered lands among his sons, and long-term planning for campaigns yet to come. Though his conquests had paused, Genghis Khan's mind remained firmly fixed on the future. Europe now knew his name. Persia lay in ruin. The Jin remained weakened, and the Song dynasty in the south beckoned. There was still much to accomplish, but perhaps most importantly, Genghis Khan had proved something few had dared imagine: that a boy born into obscurity on the Mongolian steppe could rise to command the fates of nations. Across continents, the seeds had been sown for future generations to reap. And though the man himself remained mortal, his vision of unity, of conquest, of a world connected by power and law would outlive him. Part 8. The End of the Road, the Last Years and Legacy of Genghis Khan, 1224–1227. The years following the victory over Jalal ad-Din and the return to Mongolia marked the final chapter of Genghis Khan's life, yet they were anything but quiet. The great Khan had achieved more than any man of his time, or perhaps any time. His empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, from the steppes of Central Asia to the heart of China, and his reputation as a conqueror was unparalleled. But as he grew older, the question of succession and the long-term survival of the empire loomed ever larger. In 1224, Genghis Khan turned his attention once again to the south. The Song dynasty, despite the Mongol victories in the north and their control of the Jin dynasty, was still a formidable adversary. The Song had been weakened by internal strife and external pressures, but they remained a potential thorn in the side of the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan was determined to crush the Song once and for all, but time was running out. His health, which had been strong in his earlier years, was beginning to fail. Genghis Khan's son and designated heir, Ogedei, had proven himself a capable leader. But the great Khan's increasing absence from the front lines signaled a shift in the empire's focus. There were rumors of dissent within the Mongol ranks, as some generals and leaders began to question the succession plans. Some feared that after Genghis's death, the unity of the Mongol Empire would crumble. Despite his declining health, Genghis Khan pushed forward with plans to launch an invasion of the Song capital of Hong. He called upon his generals, his sons, and his most trusted commanders to prepare for war. Yet, as the preparations were underway, Genghis Khan fell gravely ill. The precise nature of his illness remains a mystery, but it is believed that he suffered from complications stemming from a fall he had taken years earlier, which had left him with lingering injuries. Whether it was an infection, a stroke, or some other condition, the once unbeatable conqueror now found himself unable to lead. As Genghis Khan lay incapacitated, Ogedei assumed control of the military campaign against the Song, though the elder Khan could still make decisions. His physical condition prevented him from directing the battlefields as he had done in the past. Ogedei, having earned his father's trust, led the Mongol armies, continuing the campaigns that would eventually bring down the Song dynasty. Though the full conquest of China would remain unfinished during Genghis's lifetime, in 1227, as Genghis Khan's condition worsened, news arrived that the Khitan tribes in the north were becoming increasingly restless. The Mongol Empire had always been in a precarious position, surrounded by enemies and potential threats on all sides. In his final months, Genghis Khan focused much of his attention on this northern threat, attempting to secure his borders and ensure that the Khitan would not rise up in rebellion. It was in the final weeks of his life that Genghis Khan, in his characteristic determination, made the bold decision to launch a final military campaign. This would be a campaign against the Western Shia dynasty, a dynasty that had been a thorn in the side of the Mongols for years. Though it was not the grand, sweeping conquest that marked his earlier years, the Western Shia campaign was a testament to Genghis Khan's unyielding resolve, even in the face of death. However, Genghis Khan's last campaign was not to be. In the summer of 1227, during a brutal winter campaign against the Western Shia, Genghis Khan passed away. The exact circumstances of his death remain shrouded in mystery, but it is widely believed that he died either from illness or from the lingering effects of injuries sustained in earlier campaigns. Some accounts even suggest that he may have been struck by a fall from his horse during the campaign. A fitting but tragic end for a man whose life had been defined by battles on horseback. With Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire lost its guiding force, but not its strength. His death set in motion a monumental shift in the empire's leadership, as his sons, most notably Ogedei and Kublai, would continue his campaigns and expand the empire even further. However, Genghis Khan's death also created a vacuum that led to power struggles, particularly over the question of succession. Genghis Khan's death, however, did not mean the end of his legacy. His empire, though divided after his death, would continue to thrive for many years. His descendants, particularly his grandsons, such as Kublai Khan, would continue to rule vast swaths of land, with the Mongol Empire eventually splitting into several khanates, including the Yuan dynasty in China. The reach of his empire and the trade routes that were established during his reign ensured that his influence stretched far beyond his lifetime. Genghis Khan's legacy also lived on in the realm of governance and administration. The Mongol Empire, under his rule, had introduced significant reforms that laid the foundation for future empires and kingdoms. The Yasa, a legal code, set the groundwork for civil administration. His commitment to meritocracy, where individuals were promoted based on ability rather than birth, would leave a lasting impact on how future states and empires were governed. The establishment of the Yam postal system ensured communication across vast distances, something that had been previously impossible in such a large empire. Perhaps his most lasting legacy, however, was his creation of the Silk Road trade routes, which connected East and West in a way that had never been done before. By the time of Genghis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, encompassing lands from China to the heart of Europe. His reign had been one of unparalleled conquest, innovation, and expansion, but it was also a reign of transformation. Under his leadership, the Mongols moved from being a small group of nomadic tribes to rulers of one of the largest empires in history. Genghis Khan's death marked the end of an era. The man who had reshaped the world through his military genius, an unyielding determination, passed away, but the legacy of his empire endured. Even in death, his influence continued to reverberate through history, shaping the political, economic, and cultural landscape for centuries to come. The final resting place of Genghis Khan is still unknown, shrouded in mystery. Many believe that he was buried in the Mongolian steppe, his tomb hidden to preserve his sanctity. Some stories tell of a river being diverted to cover his grave, and others say that those who helped bury him were put to death to ensure the secrecy of his final resting place. What is certain, however, is that Genghis Khan's life, his conquests, and his empire would live on for as long as history is told, as the world would eventually learn. Genghis Khan had not simply been a conqueror, he had been a creator of a vast and enduring empire, of trade routes that brought cultures and civilizations together, and of a legacy that would echo through the ages. The world would remember him not only for the devastation he brought, but for the transformation he initiated in the fabric of history. Part 9. The Legacy of Genghis Khan. Impact on the world and future generations. 1227, present day. Genghis Khan's death in 1227 marked the conclusion of his incredible journey, but his legacy did not die with him. In fact, it is difficult to overstate the impact this singular figure had on the world. as his actions and decisions shaped the course of history in ways that continue to be felt today. His empire may have fragmented soon after his death, but the ripples of his conquests, policies, and innovations reverberated for centuries. Even in modern times, the influence of Genghis Khan is still a topic of fascination, controversy, and study. His legacy is one of both destruction and creation, of brutality and innovation, but ultimately, of transformation on a global scale. 1. The division of the Mongol Empire and the continuation of conquests. Following the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, his empire was divided among his 4 sons, Gib, Chagatai, Ogoday, and Tolui. However, it was his 3rd son, Ogoday, who would officially assume the title of Great Khan and continue his father's legacy of expansion. Under Ogoday's leadership, the Mongol Empire would continue to expand into Europe, the Middle East, and China, furthering the reach of Genghis Khan's original conquests. One of Ogoday's significant achievements was the conquest of the Jin dynasty in China, which had been left unfinished by Genghis Khan before his death. Under Ogoday's leadership, the Mongols completed the task of dismantling the Jin, and by 1234, the Mongol Empire controlled most of northern China. The Mongols then turned their attention southward, making their first major foray into the Song dynasty's heartland. Meanwhile, in the west, the Mongol Empire's expansion continued under the leadership of other descendants of Genghis Khan. His grandson Hulagu led the Mongols in their invasion of the Middle East, successfully conquering much of Persia and even sacking the great city of Baghdad in 1258. This event marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate, which had been one of the largest and most influential Islamic empires in history. Hulag's campaigns would ultimately pave the way for Mongol influence to spread across much of the Middle East, Central Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe. Yet, despite these victories, the Mongol Empire began to experience fractures as early as the mid-13th century. The unity that Genghis Khan had fought so hard to establish began to break down as succession disputes, internal strife, and regional differences plagued the empire. Eventually, by the end of the 13th century, the empire split into 4 distinct regions or khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. These khanates would persist for varying lengths of time, but none would maintain the vastness or cohesion of the empire created by Genghis Khan. 2. The rise of the Yuan dynasty and the fall of the Mongols in Shinoan. Of the most significant aspects of Genghis Khan's legacy is the establishment of the Yuan dynasty by his grandson Kublai Khan in China. Kublai, who had been given control over the eastern portion of the Mongol Empire, would eventually rise to become the first Mongol emperor of China, establishing a dynasty that would rule the country for nearly a century. The Yuan dynasty marked the first time that the vast Chinese empire had been ruled by a foreign power, and Kublai's rule would change the trajectory of Chinese history in profound ways. Under Kublai Khan's leadership, the Mongols sought to integrate themselves into Chinese society while maintaining their distinct cultural identity. Kublai embraced many aspects of Chinese governance, adopting the Confucian system and promoting the arts and culture of the empire. However, the Mongol rulers faced resistance from the native Chinese population, who saw the Mongols as foreign invaders. This tension would ultimately lead to the fall of the Yuan dynasty in the mid-14th century, as Chinese rebellions would eventually topple Mongol rule. Despite the eventual collapse of the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols' influence on China was undeniable. They introduced a new system of taxation and bureaucratic organization that was influenced by the Mongol system of governance. Mongol rule also led to increased trade between China and the outside world, particularly along the Silk Road, which Genghis Khan had revived and protected under Kublai Khan. China saw a period of economic growth and international exchange that would lay the foundation for future dynasties. 3. The Golden Horde and Mongol influence in Rusiaith Mongol. Conquest of Russia and the establishment of the Golden Horde is another key aspect of Genghis Khan's lasting legacy. The Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan's grandson, Battakhan, invaded the Russian principalities in the early 13th century. They ruthlessly sacked cities such as Kiev and laid waste too much of the region, leaving a mark that would last for centuries. The Mongols, however, did not directly control all of Russia. Instead, they established the Golden Horde, a Mongol state that exercised control over much of the Russian principalities through a system of vassalage. The Russian rulers were required to pay tribute to the Mongols, and in return, they were allowed to govern their territories with a degree of autonomy. The Mongol influence on Russia was profound. Under Mongol rule, the Russian principalities became more centralized and bureaucratic, laying the foundation for the eventual rise of the Russian Empire. Additionally, the Mongols introduced new military tactics and organization to the region, which would have a lasting impact on Russian warfare. 4. Genghis Khan's impact on trade, technology, and cultural exchange. Perhaps one of the most lasting aspects of Genghis Khan's empire was the vast network of trade routes and cultural exchanges that his conquests facilitated. Genghis Khan's vision of empire was not solely one of conquest. He also sought to promote trade, innovation, and the exchange of ideas between the East and West. The revival of the Silk Road under Mongol rule allowed for unprecedented contact between distant civilizations. Merchants, scholars, and artisans from across the known world, China, Persia, Europe, and India, interacted and exchanged goods and knowledge. The Mongols encouraged trade, protecting merchants from banditry and establishing an efficient postal system to facilitate communication. This exchange led to the spread of technology, such as paper-making, gunpowder, and printing, from China to the West. Genghis Khan's empire also played a key role in the spread of cultural and intellectual ideas. The Mongols welcomed scholars from different backgrounds, and many important works of literature, philosophy, and science were translated and disseminated across the empire. This cultural exchange would lay the groundwork for the Renaissance in Europe and the flourishing of science and philosophy in the Islamic world. 5. The enduring fascination with Genghis Khan and his legacy today. Genghis Khan's legacy continues to captivate the world. The complexity of his character, the enormity of his achievements, and the brutality of his conquests make him one of history's most intriguing figures. He is viewed in varying lights, by some as a barbaric conqueror, by others as a brilliant strategist and visionary. In modern Mongolia, Genghis Khan is still regarded as a national hero. His image can be seen everywhere, from statues to coins, and his legacy is celebrated through festivals and historical research. He is remembered not only as a conqueror, but as a unifier who brought the Mongol people together, establishing a shared identity and pride that endures to this day. Internationally, Genghis Khan's legacy is more complex. In the countries he conquered, his name evokes mixed emotions. In China, Russia, and Persia, he is remembered as a destructive force that brought death and destruction. However, his contributions to global trade, cultural exchange, and the administrative systems of his empire are acknowledged as foundational in shaping the modern world.